The Picts were a mysterious group of people who resided in what is now northern England and southern Scotland. Although not a great deal is known about them, historians do know the Picts caused quite a bit of trouble for the Romans in the first few centuries. So, today we're going to take a look at the Picts, a Scottish tribe that gave the Roman Empire hell. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, we'd be much obliged if you would leave a comment and let us know what other ancient people you would like to hear about. Okay, time to get painted up like an understudy for the Blue Man Group and enjoy this classical history topic we picked for you. The name Pict first emerged around the 3rd century CE. It was likely a pejorative term Romans directed at certain inhabitants of the British Isles, who they perceived to be barbarous. That is to say, that the Picts weren't a unified group of people, but rather a confederation of tribes that the Romans lumped together under one name. Basically, the Picts were the townies of ancient Rome. The Latin term Picti is most commonly translated to mean painted, which is believed to be a reference to the practice of tattooing. Several Romans, including Julius Caesar himself, described the Picts as wearing numerous tattoos and even dyeing their entire bodies blue in order to give themselves a wild look in battle. This full-body paint job was achieved using a dark blue dye called woad. This particular interpretation of the Picts' name seems to add up rather cleanly, but not all historians are in agreement on the origin of the name. Some historians believe the name might be related to a Gallic tribe known as the Pictones. Furthermore, nobody knows for sure what the Picts called themselves, or even if they viewed themselves as a single group. However, some have suggested they used the term Albadosi, which is thought to be related to the term Alba, the Gaelic name for Scotland. Alba was also sometimes used as a generalized name for the entirety of the British Isles, as well as the star of TV's Dark Angel. The Romans claimed that the Picts and other people they deemed barbarians ran around naked in battle. This isn't as crazy as it might sound. There's actually a long history of people fighting nude. It prevents chafing and distracts your enemies. And the Picts do appear to have depicted themselves naked in some of their stone carvings. That being said, it isn't entirely clear those engravings are meant to represent people who are in the actual act of fighting. It's entirely possible they were just hanging out in the buff. When they did wear clothes, however, they probably didn't wear kilts. When people think of Scottish history, they tend to picture plaid kilts, and to a lesser degree, the richest duck in the world. However, there's no evidence that their Pictish ancestors ever wore Scotland's signature garment. And while there is plenty of evidence that ancient people in Western Europe wore checked fabrics, there's nothing to suggest that each clan had its own pattern, or that tartans, the pattern cloth from which kilts are made, had the same significance they have now. In fact, some scholars believe that individual clan tartans are a much more recent invention, spurred on by a poetic interest in Highland culture in the 18th century. Located as they were on the coast of northern England and southern Scotland, the Picts were bound to set their sights on the sea. And so they did, building fleets that took to the water like ducks to, well, water. In fact, it was their seafaring skill that enabled the Picts to create an alliance with Western European peoples against the Romans. This also meant that the Picts were some of the first people to get raided by the folks we now call the Vikings, which is a bit of a dubious distinction, sort of like the first person to get macheted by Jason Voorhees, or the first person to subscribe to Showtime. Ugh. Sorry. The Picts actively participated in coastal commerce with the Romans along the southern shores of the British Isles. However, at this point in history, the difference between traders and pirates wasn't always entirely clear, so their participation wasn't always welcome, at least not from Rome's point of view. Roman sources record that the Picts were an extremely troublesome group when it came to raiding northern Britain. The Roman Brits did attempt to organize counterattacks against the Pictish pirates, but their guerrilla style of piracy made them incredibly difficult to quell. For example, the citizens of Londinium, which was the Roman name for London, recounted watching as hardcore bands of Pictish pirates would sail by after a successful raiding expedition in some small Roman-British community, spoils and captives in tow. Sort of like burglars parading up and down the cul-de-sac for your neighbors to see what they stole from you. You have a George Foreman grill? Cool. In 367 CE, the Picts allied with a group of other tribal confederations from Ireland, Germany, and beyond to create what was called the Barbarian Conspiracy. Using secret agents to get intelligence, the Picts managed to score some decisive victories over the Romans. But the emperor didn't take their defeats well, and soon sent reinforcement troops over to the British Isles to restore control. In late antiquity and the medieval period, kingships were usually passed from father to son. But it's possible that the Picts were an exception to this practice. Some scholars have theorized that royal blood wasn't patrilineal for the Picts, but matrilineal. In such a system, if a king died, he would be succeeded by his brother, who is the son of his mother, his nephew, who is the son of his sister, or his cousin, who is the son of his mother's sister. In his most famous work, Ecclesiastical History of the English People, 7th century monk and so-called father of English history, Bede reports that when Picts first arrived in the British Isles, they tried to settle in Scotland. The Scottish, who didn't want the Picts moving in, directed them to north of England, promising to help fight the current occupants if they wouldn't allow the Picts to settle. That's one way to avoid a house guest. Help them conquer the neighbors. Now, here is where things get a little weird, because Bede's story claims that the Picts had no wives and asked them of the Scots. The Scots agreed, on the condition that when any difficulty should arise, the Picts should choose a king from the female royal race rather than from the male, which custom, as is well known, has been observed among the Picts to this day. While no one could say for sure whether Bede's account of the history is accurate, a 14th century copy of a list of Pictish kings does show that fathers were never succeeded by their sons, which would be consistent with matrilineal succession. Moreover, Bede asserts that the Picts still chose their kings according to matrilineal custom during his own time. And it's difficult to argue with him, since he was there and would know. That being said, the kings on the king list are all identified by the names of their fathers, grandfathers, or brothers, implying the Picts recognized descent from their fathers. And Bede's story does specify that matrilineal descent only applied when a difficulty arose. Given the ambiguity in the evidence, scholars aren't completely sure exactly how the Picts chose their king. And even if royalty did pass through the mother's bloodline, this didn't necessarily mean that women were given more power. It's possible that they were still firmly relegated to women's work, like picking up your husband when he's too tattooed and naked to find his way home from the battlefield. The Picts were master engravers and loved inscribing intricate designs into the many stones of Scotland. There are roughly 350 surviving Pictish stones, and they contain images that range from swirls and crosses to dragons and horses, showcasing a beautiful artistic style. Although most just contain symbolic images, a few do have Agam, an ancient Irish alphabet, inscribed on them. And a Pictish script does occasionally appear on these gorgeously carved stones, but scholars have thus far been unable to decipher their language. Unfortunately, there are only a few dozen examples of how these symbols were used, and without something like the Rosetta Stone to crack the code, deciphering the symbols remains highly unlikely. But we do know the Picts had their own language, and Pictish iconography, which depicts books being carried and read, suggests that they were a literate society, although that literacy may have been limited to senior members of the clergy. While the Pictish language is extinct today, examples of it survive in place names around Scotland. For example, places beginning with Aber, Cat, Dole, and Pit are all Pictish in origin. And while we may never know what the Picts sounded like, we do know what they looked like. In 2017, scientists were able to reconstruct the face of a Pictish man who had been brutally slain. After being killed around 600 CE, the poor fellow was buried in the back of a Scottish cave, with his legs placed in a strange cross-legged position and stones holding down all of his limbs. Maybe whoever buried him wasn't sure he was dead and wanted to make sure he didn't burst up out of the ground like a heavily tattooed zombie thirsty for revenge. Reconstruction revealed that this Pictish gentleman was kind of handsome and rather young. The area in which the body was discovered also revealed hearths and ironworking debris, suggesting the Picts used the cave as a forge. The process also revealed that he died after 5 incredibly hard blows to his head and mouth. But the bizarre manner in which the body was buried makes it difficult to draw any firm conclusions about what exactly happened to the young man. It is possible he was sacrificed, or maybe just murdered. The only thing we know for certain is that somebody beat the hell out of him and buried him weirdly in a cave for scientists to discover centuries later. Maybe they were jealous of his boyish good looks and his skill at the forge. Believe it or not, St. Patrick, head religious honcho of Christian Ireland and namesake of the biggest day-drinking holiday in America, was actually born in Britain. There he came into contact with the Picts and other people who hadn't yet made the jump to Christianity. And, surprise, surprise, he wasn't a big fan of them. In his letter to the soldiers of Coroticus, Patrick condemned his own countrymen, calling them as bad as the Irish and the apostate Picts for killing newly baptized Christians. What exactly he meant by apostate, a term referring to someone who has renounced their faith, is up for debate. It is possible that the Picts had accepted Christianity and then later rejected it, but it's also possible they denied it right from the start, and St. Patrick was just being dramatic with his word choice. No one knows. While the history of the Picts begins sometime in late antiquity, by the 10th century, they were gone. Or more precisely, Scotland didn't have people called Picts anymore. So, where did they go? Well, sometime around the year 840, under the control of the Scots-Irish king Kenneth MacAlpin, who interestingly might have had a Pictish mother, Scotland became a relatively unified realm. Kenneth himself was known as the King of the Picts, but by the reign of his grandson, Cosham MacAue, outsiders were referring to the kingdom as the Kingdom of Alba, rather than the Kingdom of the Picts. Whether this is because a new kingdom was founded, or because Alba was more closely related to what the Picts called themselves, is unknown. Whatever the case, it appears that the larger Gaelic kingdom ultimately just absorbed the Picts. But was it all peaceful? Probably not. Although very little of Kenneth's conquest of the Picts was recorded, what we do know suggests the Picts presented little in the way of resistance, and that Kenneth likely massacred their leaders and armies. In this way, Kenneth was kind of like the Borg. Assimilation sounds nice, but glosses over all the robot zombie violence. But the Picts didn't entirely disappear. According to a 2013 genetics study, about 10% of Scottish lads are descended from the ancient Picts. A distinctive Y chromosome marker called R1b S530, which is characteristic of the Picts, appeared 10 times more often in males of Scottish patrilineal descent than in other individuals. In contrast, less than 1% of Englishmen and 3% of Irishmen tested had the gene from their paternal grandfathers. Not even the Roman Empire or 1,000 years of relentless time could completely conquer the Picts. So what do you think about the Picts? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.